Amelia S.'s husband believed his wealth made him untouchable, but at their grand gender reveal, she turned his perfect image into his worst nightmare. One announcement changed everything: love, trust, family, and the future of her unborn child. This story reminds us, truth always finds its moment. Please give the channel one like and one share to motivate us. Thanks for watching.
The air in the garden felt heavy, almost electric, charged with a nervous tension that had absolutely nothing to do with the gender reveal we were all supposedly waiting for. I stood near the marble fountain, my hand resting protectively over my growing belly, wearing a smile that had become my best accessory, a flawless, practiced mask for the hundreds of onlookers gathered on the lawn. My husband, Julian, stood right at my side, his arm wrapped around my waist in a grip that felt less like affection and more like ownership. Across the manicured grass, my gaze kept wandering toward the woman in the striking crimson dress, Serafina, Julian's colleague. Her predatory eyes didn't just look at me, they seemed to dismantle me, piece by piece, with a smirk that felt like a secret declaration of war against everything I was and everything I stood for in this house. This night was never truly intended to be a simple celebration of our baby's gender. It was the stage for a massive, long overdue reckoning. A truth bomb I had spent the last week carefully crafting in the silence of my own thoughts. I wanted the explosion to be deafening, far more impactful than any confetti cannon could ever be. I was Amelia Worthington to the public, but deep down, I was still Amelia Thorne. And I had spent far too long believing in the fairy tales Julian fed me. That era of blind, naive devotion ended the moment I realized the man I married was nothing but a hollow architect of his own grand, gilded deceptions. Tonight, the walls of his carefully constructed life were going to come crashing down, and I would be the one holding the hammer, watching it all crumble. Marrying Julian Worthington had truly felt like wandering into a dream. He was the golden scion of a massive real estate empire, and his world was one of endless, sparkling luxury. We lived in a sprawling, white stone mansion in Bel Air, complete with panoramic views of the city that seemed to stretch on forever into the night. Our lives were a blur of private jet trips to Monaco, charity galas in designer couture, and the kind of lifestyle most people only see in movies. In those early years, Julian was everything I wanted: attentive, charming, and endlessly generous with his time and his affection. He made me feel like I was the center of his universe, a queen presiding over a kingdom built just for us, or so I had convinced myself at the time. Ignoring every red flag along the way, he had swept me off my feet, slowly convincing me that his world was meant for me too. I had been a successful architect in my own right, but over the last 5 years, I slowly traded my drafting table for black tie charity events and my site visits for high society luncheons. The illusion was nearly perfect. I believed in the man he presented to the world, and more importantly, I believed in the man he told me he was behind closed doors. I loved him, or at least I loved the carefully constructed image he had sold to me since the day we met. It was a beautiful, seductive lie that kept me blinded to the reality of who he really was, keeping me occupied with the surface while the foundation beneath us was slowly rotting away from neglect and complete emotional abandonment. Now, with our first child on the way, I felt a primal, deep joy that I hoped would finally ground us. I wanted this baby to be the bridge that mended the subtle, growing cracks in our marriage. Lately, Julian had been drifting away from me, physically present but mentally absent. When I asked what was wrong, he would just murmur about stress from the firm, his fingers dancing across his phone screen while his eyes darted anywhere but mine. The distance between us was growing into a canyon, and I was desperately trying to ignore the signs. I kept telling myself that it was just a phase, that the pressure of the upcoming baby was weighing on him. But the silence between us started to feel heavier than any conversation we ever had in our home. Late nights at the office became the new normal, punctuated by hushed, urgent phone calls he took in the quiet of his study. Then there was the scent of faint, lingering trace of an expensive, unfamiliar perfume clinging to his suits. It was nothing like my own Chanel No. 5. I tried to dismiss the growing paranoia, telling myself it was just pregnancy hormones or the inherent insecurity that comes with living in a world of mirrors and shadows. But the gnawing in my gut was becoming impossible to silence. It was a cold, persistent feeling that told me something was deeply wrong, even if I refused to acknowledge the truth. Every time I reached out to hold his hand or ask about his day, he seemed to pull back just an inch, distancing himself from me more and more. The gender reveal party was Julian's idea, not mine. He insisted on it with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, his enthusiasm feeling brittle and forced. He wanted the best of the best. Hiring the same elite firm that handled the high-profile Van Heusen Gala, he talked about celebrating our little prince or princess with such fervor that it made me feel like an outsider looking into a performance. I just nodded, letting him dictate the terms, all while the dread settled deeper into my bones. It felt like he was throwing this party for his own ego rather than for the child we were expecting. He focused on the spectacle, the lights, the guest list, and the prestige, while I felt like a prop in a play I didn't audition for, just waiting for the curtain to finally drop. I wanted the evening to be perfect, hoping that a public display of our love might finally kill the doubts that kept me awake at night. I threw myself into the details, settling on a theme of twinkle, twinkle, little star, envisioning a magical night under the California sky. I spent hours working with the event planners, trying to build a fantasy that felt solid. I was desperate for something real, something that would prove we were still a family. But every choice I made felt like I was decorating a tomb. I kept pushing forward, forcing a smile and nodding at color schemes, thinking that if I made the surface perfect, the reality underneath would somehow align. It was a frantic, exhausting attempt to save a marriage that was already slipping through my fingers like sand. Blue and pink ribbons decorated the vast gardens, and a custom stage was built right next to the shimmering infinity pool. Everything was ready for the big reveal. Then, just 1 week before the event, Julian dropped the first blow. He looked at me, calm as could be, and said he needed to invite Serafina Monet to the party. I froze, my hand still resting on my belly, trying to make sense of why he would bring a business colleague to such an intimate moment. It felt like a slap in the face. Why now? Why her? The name hung in the air, cold and unfamiliar, yet somehow it carried a weight that made my breath hitch in my throat. I stood there, staring at him, waiting for an explanation that I knew would never truly satisfy me. Serafina Monet. I didn't even recognize the name at first. He waved it off, saying she was a new associate who was critical for the Dubai project and that it would be rude not to include her since she was in town. He wouldn't even look at me, choosing to fiddle with his expensive Cartier cufflinks instead. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach, turning the excitement I had been cultivating into pure, freezing ice. I knew then that this wasn't about networking. It was something far more personal and far more dangerous. His avoidance, the way he couldn't meet my eyes, told me everything I needed to know. He was bringing a ghost into our home, and he expected me to act as if nothing were wrong, as if she were just another guest. The name felt like a curse, yet his forced casualness was what really set my teeth on edge. I asked him, point blank, why a stranger had to be at our baby's reveal. He snapped at me, telling me not to be difficult and that it was just a simple courtesy. He insisted that she wouldn't be the only business contact there, but his tone told a different story. He was trying to normalize her presence in our private life, and the sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just about an invitation. It was about the total lack of respect he had for me and our unborn child. He was testing my boundaries, seeing how much he could push before I finally pushed back. But he didn't realize that I had already reached my breaking point. He told me it was just how his world worked, effectively reminding me that this was his reality, not mine. The line between us, which had been blurring for years, was suddenly incredibly sharp. I stopped arguing, but a profound sense of clarity replaced my confusion. That night, sleep was impossible. The name Serafina Monet wouldn't leave my head. Driven by an instinct I couldn't suppress, I crept out of bed, heart pounding, and headed toward his private study. I had to know. I had to see for myself what was behind this wall he had built around himself. The silence of the house was deafening, but it matched the cold resolve that was beginning to settle deep in my chest. I wasn't going to live in the dark anymore. His laptop was securely closed, but his personal tablet sat right there on the mahogany desk. It was password protected, but I knew his habits better than anyone. My hands shook as I entered the code. Our anniversary. Denied. His birthday. Nothing. Finally, I entered the groundbreaking date of his very first skyscraper. A soft click echoed in the silence of the room, and the screen lit up, exposing everything he had been hiding from me. There it was, his private world, open for me to see. I felt a wave of nausea, but I pushed it down. I had come too far to turn back now. I took a deep breath, braced myself for whatever I was about to find, and started to scroll through the secrets he thought were safe. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic rhythm that matched the rising panic in my chest. I bypassed his emails and went straight to his secure messaging apps, my hands shaking as I navigated the interface. It did not take long to find the folder labeled with a simple, singular S. Inside was a digital archive of betrayal, explicit messages, intimate photos, records of secret hotel stays, and receipts for lavish gifts. A Birkin bag here, a diamond tennis bracelet there. It was all there, laid out in cold, digital detail. I read through the messages, the words burning into my mind. Every lie, every excuse, every stolen moment. It was all documented right there in black and white. It was worse than I could have ever imagined. A catalog of deceit that stripped away the last remnants of the man I thought I knew. And the woman on the other end of the messages was Serafina Monet. There were photos of her. A woman with fiery red hair and sharp, aggressive features that exuded a dangerous kind of confidence. She wore the scent I had smelled on Julian's suits. The blood drained from my face so quickly that I felt faint. Tears welled up, blurring the screen. But I forced myself to read every single word, burning the evidence into my memory. It was so clinical, so deliberate, and yet so incredibly cruel. I could see how they talked about me, how they laughed about my pregnancy, how they planned their future while I was left in the dark. It was a devastating blow, one that left me reeling in the dim light of the study, gasping for air as the gravity of his infidelity finally crushed my spirit. It wasn't just a fling. It was a full-blown relationship, a parallel life Julian was funding with the money we were supposed to be building a future with. The Dubai project was real, yes, but Serafina was clearly his lover, not his associate. The request to invite her to our home for our baby's celebration was not a courtesy, it was a power move, a final act of humiliation intended to prove how little he cared for my feelings. He wanted me to stand there, smiling and pregnant, while his mistress watched from the sidelines. It was the ultimate betrayal, a calculated attempt to break me down completely. But he had underestimated me. He had forgotten that I was the one who built the foundation he was standing on. And foundations can be demolished. That realization made me physically sick, my stomach churning with the bitter taste of reality. The fairy tale shattered in my mind, the glass shards falling everywhere. The gilded cage I had been living in was now clearly a prison built of his lies. And the worst part, my innocent child was about to be brought into this charade, forced to grow up in a world where their father valued a mistress over his own family. That was the part that hurt the most. I could handle the betrayal to me, but the thought of my child being raised in this environment of deceit was something I simply could not tolerate. It gave me a new purpose, a reason to fight back with everything I had. I wasn't just doing this for myself anymore. I was doing it for my baby. No, that was not going to happen. Not on my watch. A new, cold, and razor-sharp anger began to replace the despair that had threatened to drown me. If Julian wanted to invite his mistress to our child's gender reveal, then I would let her come. I remembered who I was before I became a trophy wife. I was an architect. I knew how to build, and more importantly, I knew how to tear things down. I had the blueprints. I knew the structure, and I knew exactly where the weak points were. If he wanted to host a party, I would make sure it was a party that no one would ever forget. I was finished with being a victim. It was time to take control of my own life and orchestrate the final act of this miserable tragedy. I wasn't going to crumble. I was going to dismantle everything he had built on a foundation of lies. I had 6 days before the party. 6 days to turn his perfectly planned stage into the place where his entire reputation would finally collapse. The theme of Twinkle, Twinkle. Little Star suddenly felt like a cruel joke, but I would make sure the climax was a supernova that would burn his world to the ground. I started planning my move. Carefully, methodically, I had to be patient, stay focused, and wait for the right moment. Every detail had to be perfect. The revenge would be sweet, but more than that. It would be a complete and total destruction of the lies he had built his life on, leaving nothing but dust behind. I had to be perfect for the next few days. I became a master of deception, playing the role of the radiant, oblivious mother-to-be. I sat with the event coordinator, Mrs. Gable, smiling as we picked out flowers and sampled tiny eclairs. All the while, my mind was racing with a cold, calculated strategy. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of my own liberation. I played the part so well that Julian didn't even notice the change in me. He was too busy with his own schemes to realize that I was working on something much, much bigger. I kept my composure, stayed calm, and watched him like a hawk, waiting for the perfect time to strike, knowing that every smile was just another brick in the wall of his eventual downfall. Inside, I was a woman reborn, fueled by a mixture of grief and a resolve I didn't know I possessed. I researched Serafina Monate. She was a high-flying executive at a rival firm, known for being cutthroat and ruthless. Her social media was a perfect highlight reel of luxury, power, and a lifestyle that mirrored Julian's. She wanted the life I had, and he was more than happy to hand it over to her. But she didn't know who she was messing with. I had spent years in the world of high-stakes architecture, dealing with impossible clients and cutthroat competitors. She was just another hurdle, another obstacle to overcome. I wasn't going to let her win. I was going to make sure that she and Julian paid for every single lie. One by one, there were 0 photos of us together on social media, yet with my newfound clarity, the pattern was impossible to ignore. A stunning view from a balcony in Monte Carlo posted 2 weeks apart, the same distinct, abstract painting in the background of our separate dinner posts. Julian had not been careful at all. He had been arrogant, assuming I was too complacent, or perhaps too naive to notice the digital breadcrumbs he was leaving behind. He thought he was playing a brilliant, sophisticated game. But every move he made only served to paint a clearer picture of his ultimate betrayal. It was almost insulting how little effort he put into hiding his tracks, as if he truly believed he was untouchable in his own little world. I insisted that the formal invitation for Serafina should come directly from me, personally. I told Julian it would look far more gracious and appropriate if the wife extended the formal welcome. He was so relieved to think that I was finally playing along that he never even questioned my true motives. He was completely blind to the cold, calculating glint in my eyes as I wrote the card on my finest Tiffany stationery, sealing his fate with a polite, practiced smile. It was the perfect trap, laid out in plain sight, and he walked right into it without a single second thought, completely unaware that he had just handed me the weapon I would use to destroy his carefully crafted social facade. I reached out to my best friend, Chloe, a sharp-witted attorney who had never once trusted Julian's manufactured, rehearsed charm. We met at a secluded, hidden tea house in Pasadena to carefully go over the details. As I laid out the mounting evidence of his duplicity, Chloe's Earl Grey nearly went flying across the table. Her initial shock quickly morphed into a cold, hard anger that mirrored my own. She looked at me, her legal mind already analyzing the damage we could do and the best way to leverage this information against the man who had lied to us both for years. We were partners in this, and for the first time since the discovery, I felt like I was actually gaining ground against his endless web of deceit. She could not fathom his sheer audacity. Inviting the mistress to a gender reveal party, it was beyond disrespectful. It was strategic, absolute suicide. I told her I was done crying over his twisted games. I was in a war now, and for the first time, I had the high ground. Chloe leaned in, asking for the plan, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper as the wheels started to turn. We were going to make sure that this celebration was not remembered for the baby, but for the exact moment Julian's carefully constructed, pathetic double life finally came crashing down. It was going to be glorious. A public reckoning that he could never recover from, no matter how much money or influence he tried to throw at the problem later on. Divorce, asset freezing, and total public exposure were all on the table, but that was for later. For now, I wanted the party to be the breaking point. He thought I was a fool, and he thought she was clever. I was going to use his own stage to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. My silence until this point had been a tactical choice, but now the time for silence was over. It was time for the truth to take center stage and burn his world to the ground in front of everyone he cared about. There would be no mercy, no second chances, and certainly no turning back once the curtain finally rose on the mess I had prepared for them. Chloe's eyes lit up with a dangerous sense of excitement. She told me this was going to be better than any courtroom drama she had ever seen. She asked for the specific details of my plan. I explained that the big reveal was supposed to involve those massive, high-end confetti cannons that shower the guests in colored smoke and glitter. He had planned for a beautiful, sentimental announcement, but I had a completely different reveal in mind. A reveal that would ensure he could never hide from the truth again, no matter how hard he tried to spin it. I could already see the look of absolute horror on their faces when the smoke cleared, and it was the only thing keeping me going through these final, grueling days. Corbin Catering handles the logistics for our high-profile gender reveal party, and their reputation for professionalism is truly legendary. They are scheduled to receive the sealed medical envelope directly from Dr. Alistair tomorrow morning. Alistair is my obstetrician and the sole person who currently knows the gender of my baby. This envelope is destined for the event planners, and it must remain perfectly sealed until the precise moment of the grand reveal. This protocol is the industry standard for these types of lavish celebrations, designed specifically to ensure absolute secrecy. However, they have no idea that I have already coordinated with the doctor to swap the contents, ensuring that the reveal is exactly what I need it to be. "You are actually thinking of a simple color switch," Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of genuine concern and high-stakes anticipation. I corrected her firmly, noting that my objective had to be far more informative than a simple shift in shade. I need to gain access to that envelope, or, at the very least, take complete control over what gets loaded into those cannons. And I have to pull this off without a single person, especially Julian or his snooping mistress, ever suspecting a thing. The challenge in front of me was massive, but the betrayal I had uncovered made the danger feel secondary. I knew I had to make my move. Corbin Catering is renowned for its extreme discretion and tight security protocols, which made breaching their operations a formidable task. I spent the next 48 hours in constant observation mode. I even attended a final walkthrough with Mrs. Gable, the lead planner, where I feigned intense interest in minor details like napkin folds and lighting cues. All the while, I was methodically mapping out the backstage area, identifying every security camera blind spot, and learning the exact, rigid procedure they used for handling the gender reveal mechanism during the entire setup phase. I carefully noted that the cannons were prepared in a small, guarded tent located behind the main stage just a few hours before the event began. The final loading of the reveal material was handled exclusively by a senior Corbin technician, which meant my window of opportunity was razor-thin. My mind raced through every possible scenario. I realized that attempting to swap the doctor's envelope directly was far too risky, as it would surely be traced back to me the moment the discrepancies were discovered. I needed a plan that was much more sophisticated and entirely untraceable. I realized I needed a way to influence the actual outcome, rather than just messing with the input. What if the cannons did not just reveal a color? What if they revealed something else entirely? A truly daring idea began to take shape in my mind, sparked by a distant memory of a corporate event I had designed years ago. In that scenario, a product launch had involved a surprise projection onto a massive screen that unrolled simultaneously with a blast of confetti. I could adapt that logic here to turn their own grand celebration into the stage for my personal, final act. Meanwhile, Julian was acting almost jovial, clearly relieved that I was being so understanding and compliant. He even brought home a gift for me, a stunning diamond necklace, claiming it was a token of appreciation for being such a wonderful wife and a mother-to-be. He spoke with a voice as smooth as silk, trying to hide his guilt behind expensive jewelry. I accepted the necklace with a radiant, practiced smile, though the diamonds felt like jagged ice against my skin. I knew he thought he had successfully played me, but he had no idea what was actually coming his way. I made sure to wear those diamonds when Serafina Monet arrived at our doorstep 2 days before the party. She was there ostensibly for a pre-event consultation with Julian regarding some fabricated detail of the Dubai project, but I insisted on being present for every minute of it. Serafina was even more striking in person, tall, impeccably dressed in a razor-sharp Armani suit, her auburn hair styled in a sleek, intimidating bob. She carried herself with the kind of entitlement that made me realize just how much she felt she had already taken from me. Her handshake was firm, and her green eyes assessed me with an unnerving, predatory intensity. There was not a single hint of apology or discomfort in her demeanor, only a cool, almost triumphant confidence. She moved through our home as if she already owned a significant portion of it. "Your home is lovely, Amelia," she commented, her voice a low, melodic purr, as Julian eagerly showed her the patio where the cocktails would be served later. She was marking her territory right in front of me, and I had to work very hard to keep my expression neutral. "Julian has such exquisite taste," she added, with an emphasis on Julian that was not lost on me. I kept my smile unwavering and replied, "He does, though sometimes his acquisitions can be a little fleeting." Serafina's eyes narrowed just enough for me to notice. Julian, completely oblivious to the subtext, chuckled loudly. "Amelia has a keen sense of humor," he said, trying to diffuse the air. The tension between the two of us was a silent, crackling current that existed far beneath the thin, polished veneer of our polite conversation. I held my ground. Serafina made a point of touching Julian's arm and laughing a bit too loudly at his jokes, clearly trying to stake her claim in my own territory. Each gesture felt like a fresh stab to my heart, but instead of breaking me, it only hardened my resolve. This woman, this serpent, would not slither into my life and destroy it without paying a consequence. The party was no longer just about addressing Julian's betrayal. It was about reclaiming my dignity and exposing the truth for every guest to see. I was ready to burn the whole thing down. It was about finally expunging Serafina's venomous presence from my life as well. The plan forming in my mind became bolder and more audacious with every passing hour. It had to be flawless, and it had to be completely unforgettable. The day before the party, Dr. Alistair S. Crisp sealed envelope was hand-delivered to Mrs. Gable at the Corbin Catering headquarters. I watched the delivery from my car parked across the street, my heart beating like a frantic drum against my ribs. I knew this was the point of no return for my scheme. The first crucial piece of my plan was officially in motion. Now I had to tackle the infinitely more complex part, intercepting the reveal itself, while the envelope was now the responsibility of Corbin Catering. I knew the actual contents, the colored powder or confetti, would not be loaded into the cannons until the team was on site on the day of the party. My initial idea of simply swapping the doctor's note was far too risky, as it was easily traceable. I needed to ensure the physical evidence was what actually hit the crowd. I knew tracking would be impossible if I simply swapped an envelope. And what if the planners decided to cross-reference the report? It was too risky. I needed a direct intervention, something that altered the actual output rather than the input. My friend Chloe, always resourceful, suggested her cousin Leo. He was an event technician who occasionally freelanced for elite companies like Corbin. Because he was never on their official payroll, he was the perfect, invisible asset for a job like this. I knew I had to secure his cooperation if I wanted my plan to succeed. After much persuasion from Chloe, and a very generous promise of a consultation fee paid from my private inheritance, my husband Julian had never even touched, Leo finally agreed to meet. We chose a dimly lit, secluded booth at the Viper Room on the Sunset Strip, a spot Julian would never visit in a million years. It was a bit dark and seedy, but the privacy was essential. We needed to map out the logistics of my plan without any prying ears hovering nearby to catch our conversation. Leo was a wiry young man with eyes that constantly darted around, scanning every corner for cameras or listeners. When I initially brought the job to him, he was incredibly skittish, pulling away as if he could smell a trap. He told me that messing with a Corbin production was dangerous because they were serious players. I leaned in, locking eyes with him, and told him that if things went sideways, he would be long gone before the heat hit him. I promised this was not about mindless sabotage, just one surgical modification. I swore his name would stay off the record. I laid the whole plan out for him, making sure he understood. This was not some simple prank or a request to change the color of the stage smoke. My vision was far more theatrical and, frankly, devastating. I wanted to swap out the standard confetti in the main cannons or, at the very least, fill them with something more permanent. When he asked if I wanted colored smoke or the usual glitter, he was clearly intrigued despite his nerves. I nodded slowly, watching his reaction. I was ready to turn their perfect party into a public reckoning, and I had the material ready. When he asked what I wanted inside those cannons, I slid a small, heavy satin pouch across the table. Leo picked it up, and his eyebrows arched in surprise when he felt the weight of the contents. I leaned in close, whispering that it felt like shredded paper, because that is exactly what it was. But it was not office trash. It was every dirty secret they had. I showed him a sample on my phone, graphic messages between Julian and Serafina, hotel booking confirmations, and that blurry, damning image of them kissing in a public restaurant. I had burned through a significant chunk of my grandmother's inheritance to hire a private investigator to dig up all this dirt. Each tiny, shredded strip of paper would be a physical piece of their sordid affair, ready to rain down on them. When I told him we were going to fire these out of the cannons, Leo was shocked, but then a slow, wicked grin spread across his face. He called the plan diabolical and brilliant. Then he hit me with the practical problem. How could we swap the cartridges inside the cannons without being spotted? That was his department. I kept my voice steady, reminding Leo that his technical mastery was the only reason I had chosen him for this operation. I understood that the final preparations for the confetti cannons happened in a secluded tent behind the main stage, and I had mapped out the precise timeline for when he needed to move. I promised to create a massive diversion for the lead Corbin technician at the exact right moment. All Leo had to do was dress like any other event staffer and make the swap. It had to be lightning fast, totally silent, and perfectly timed. Leo paused, staring at me, mentally calculating the logistics and weighing the fee against the very real danger of getting caught by the catering team. Leo explained that the cartridges were factory sealed, so he would need to bring his own pre-filled canisters, stuffed with my evidence confetti, ensuring they were completely indistinguishable from the real gear. I pressed him for a definitive answer, and he admitted the risk was massive. But when he named his price, a figure that made me blink but did not stop me, I simply nodded. I gave him my word that he would remain completely anonymous throughout the aftermath. He agreed to source the blank cartridges and get them loaded with my specific material well before the big event began. Then he stopped, looking at me, and asked about the baby. He wanted to know if I really wanted to skip the gender reveal. I paused, catching my breath. For a second, the original, innocent excitement of the party, the joy of discovering if I was having a boy or a girl washed over me, and I felt a sharp, genuine pang of sadness. I looked at him, and said that the gender of the baby was the least interesting secret in our family right now. I told him my doctor would inform me privately later. I had a different, darker truth to expose to everyone tonight. For the party, the only reveal I cared about was the truth regarding Julian and his mistress. But then, a new, even more aggressive layer to my plan clicked into place. I realized why I should stop at just the paper confetti. I looked at Leo with a sharp, cold light in my eyes and told him I had a new idea for the color. I wanted something that would still technically be a reveal, but absolutely not the one they were planning. I needed the visual impact to be total, where every single guest understood exactly what they were looking at the second it happened. I told him I needed his help with the entire lighting and projection system. 2. I laid out my expanded vision. The cannons would fire the evidence, but the paper would be a specific, symbolic color, and at the exact same time, the massive screen behind the stage, which was meant to show sweet baby pictures, would display something far more undeniable. Leo listened to the full plan, his initial apprehension shifting into a look of fascinated horror. He understood exactly how much damage this would cause to Julian and his carefully curated public image. Leo looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. He told me I really did not mess around, and he was absolutely right. He admitted that the projection mapping and timed release were complex, but if the diversion was good enough, he could make it happen. The diversion was Chloe's job. As a high-powered lawyer, she was an expert at staging urgent, chaotic scenarios that demanded total attention. She was tasked with staging a fake emergency legal call for the head planner, Mrs. Gable, right at the critical moment of the event. Chloe would need to pull Mrs. Gable away from the tent, giving Leo the clear window he needed to make the swap. The day of the party finally arrived, bright and annoyingly calm. I moved through the house like a ghost, my mind acting as a steel trap, obsessively checking my timings and backup plans. Julian was completely oblivious, fussing over his speech and patting my stomach with a possessive pride that made my skin crawl. He had no idea the trap was set and waiting for him. Serafina was going to be there, and I had personally ensured her name was at the very top of the guest list. I wanted her front and center when the world fell apart. Late in the afternoon, the Corbin team was everywhere, turning the estate into a wonderland of pastel colors and lights. Leo was there too, dressed in the standard black tech uniform, blending in perfectly. He looked like just another worker, and I felt confident that he would play his part without a single slip or hesitation. He slipped past Amelia with a sharp, subtle nod, his hands rock-steady as he gripped his heavy toolbox. It was not full of wrenches or cables, but hundreds of custom confetti cartridges packed tight with shredded secrets printed on blood-red paper. That specific color of shame, the same aggressive scarlet that Serafina wore like armor, was the centerpiece of the setup. He knew exactly what he was doing, and every sheet in those canisters was designed to rewrite the history of this fake, gilded evening. Amelia felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she kept her composure. Across the lawn, Chloe was on high alert, her phone charged and her cover story ready to go. The first elite guests would be arriving in 2 hours, and the trap was perfectly set. As the architect of this downfall, she stood back, watching her plans click into place. She rested a hand on her stomach, thinking of her child. This public demolition was not just about revenge, but about reclaiming a future. She needed to make sure her child was born into a world of truth, not hidden away in a cage built from Julian's lies. The financial cost would be massive, and the social scandal would be truly legendary. But she decided her freedom was worth more than his reputation. As the sun began to dip, painting the Los Angeles sky in shades of bruised lavender and soft rose, the Worthington estate came alive. Thousands of fairy lights began to twinkle, making the property look like a magical dreamland. Dozens of lanterns cast a warm, flickering glow over the perfectly manicured grass, while soft, elegant music from a string quartet drifted through the air. The guests, a curated mix of old money, tech giants, and socialites, arrived in a steady stream of black Bentleys and sleek cars. Their diamonds caught the light, and their designer outfits sparkled brilliantly. It was the absolute definition of extreme wealth, designed to distract everyone from the rot that was hiding just beneath the surface. The evening was a masterclass in opulence, an event so lavishly staged by the experts at Corbin Catering that the elite guests could do little but whisper in awe. Amelia held her position right beside Julian near the main entrance, a striking figure in a flowing, ivory gown that gracefully draped over her growing belly. She wore a serene, practiced smile, yet it never quite reached her eyes. Beneath that polished exterior, her gaze held a sharp, predatory gleam that only Chloe, arriving at that precise moment with a firm, supportive squeeze on her arm, would have correctly identified for what it truly was. Julian stood there, looking resplendent in a custom-tailored suit, clearly feeling like the king of his own castle as he moved through the crowd. He greeted high-profile guests with booming, practiced laughter and friendly, confident backslapping, playing his part to perfection. He remained completely oblivious to the massive, building storm that was moments away from shattering his carefully constructed world. Then, the specific moment Amelia had been anticipating arrived. Serafina Monet stepped into the light, a shocking, deliberate slash of deep crimson in a sea of soft pastels, drawing every single eye in the garden toward her. Her dress was a true masterpiece of couture, a deep, blood-red shade that served as a silent, defiant proclamation to every guest in the room. She wore massive, brilliant diamonds that caught the light, dripping from her ears and throat like jagged icicles, while her auburn hair was pulled back into an elaborate, severe chignon. She moved through the crowd with an oily, sinuous grace, her gaze scanning the room with cold, calculating precision until her eyes finally locked onto Julian. A second later, she flicked a dismissive look toward Amelia, a tiny condescending gesture that confirmed everything. "Julian, my darling," Serafina purred, leaning in to deliver a practiced air kiss that hovered just inches from his lips, her manicured hand lingering on his forearm for a second too long. "What a magnificent party you have thrown tonight. And Amelia," she added, turning to face her with a smile that was sharp, thin, and entirely devoid of warmth. "You look positively blooming this evening." Amelia held her ground, meeting that cold stare with a calm, steel-like resolve. "Serafina," she replied, her voice smooth as warm honey but laced with an Arctic frost. "I am truly delighted that you could finally make it. Crimson is certainly your color," Amelia added, watching Serafina's face closely for any sign of a crack in her polished armor. A flicker of genuine surprise, followed by a flash of deep annoyance, crossed Serafina's features before she regained her icy, rehearsed composure. "Thank you. I always believe in making a bold impression when I walk into a room," she retorted. "Oh, you certainly will," Amelia murmured to herself as Julian, beaming with pride and completely blind to the tension, steered Serafina toward the champagne fountain to introduce her to a group of influential investors who were eagerly hoping to get in on his latest business venture. Amelia watched them from a distance, a cold, hard fury solidifying deep in her chest as she realized the true, gutting depth of their disrespect. Serafina was not merely attending as a guest. She was acting as the true lady of the manor, Julian's partner in every sense, and the sheer audacity of the woman was honestly breathtaking. Chloe materialized beside Amelia, handing her a small, chilled glass of sparkling cranberry juice. "Showtime is approaching." "Partner," she whispered, keeping her voice low, steady, and perfectly controlled so no one nearby would overhear their conversation. "Leo is hidden in the wings, his hands hovering over the triggers, while the massive cannons are stuffed to the brim with the crimson confetti." Chloe keeps her eyes glued to her watch, checking the final countdown. She just confirmed the systems are fully primed, and the projection screen is synced up perfectly. Everything is ready to go. "Are you ready for this?" Amelia just sips her drink, enjoying the sharp, tart flavor on her tongue. Her focus remains locked on Serafina, who is laughing loudly with her head thrown back. Meanwhile, Julian leans in, whispering some private, intimate nothing in her ear that makes her beam with that arrogant, knowing smile. "More than ready. Chloe, It is time to tear down this entire charade, Amelia says. Her voice barely a whisper in the night air. The party swirls around them, a strange, suffocating symphony of fake smiles and toxic secrets that feel heavy enough to choke on. Amelia drifts through the crowd, playing the part of the perfect, gracious hostess. She accepts endless, hollow congratulations from people who have absolutely no clue what is coming. All the while, her internal clock ticks down the final seconds. She keeps watching Julian as he introduces Serafina to their colleagues, acting as if his life is perfectly normal. "My brilliant associate, Serafina Monet," he says to every new guest he greets. Amelia can hear the unspoken subtext, the silent, smug nod to a secret affair he thinks is perfectly hidden. About an hour before the big reveal, Chloe moves to the next phase of their plan. She walks up to Mrs. Gable, the catering boss, wearing a look of perfectly manufactured panic. "Mrs. Gable," she says, pulling her aside into a corner, her voice desperate and professional, "I have a massive problem. I am so incredibly sorry to bother you during your busiest moment, but I just received an urgent call from our legal team about the pyrotechnics vendor. There is a major, last-minute insurance issue that requires your immediate signature. If you do not sign off now, they are threatening to pull all their services for your next big event, and we cannot afford that kind of public relations nightmare tonight." Mrs. Gable, a woman who prides herself on absolute perfection, looks completely horrified by the news. "What?" she gasps, her hands starting to shake. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" "Chloe, they were extremely insistent, and they mentioned a critical deadline expiring in the next 30 minutes, Chloe says, keeping her voice firm, authoritative, and totally believable. "They need your direct verbal authorization codes right now. I have them waiting on the line in the West Wing study, and it is vital we handle this immediately." Mrs. Gable, flustered and visibly irritated by the interruption, excuses herself and rushes off with Chloe. This leaves the backstage area momentarily unguarded and vulnerable. It is Leo's window of opportunity. Amelia, who had been talking about dinner options with a nearby group, watches him slip into the small, guarded tent behind the stage. Her heart hammers against her ribs, a frantic, loud rhythm in the quiet space of her own mind. This is it. There is no turning back from this moment. He has less than 5 minutes to finalize the technical work for the finale. Amelia immediately engages the remaining junior technician in an intense, complicated conversation about lighting angles for the evening photos, laughing at his technical answers. Her voice is light and engaging, forcing him to pay attention to her instead of the tent. Every second stretches into an eternity. Then, Leo walks out, looking calm and collected, giving her the tiniest, almost invisible nod before disappearing back into the crowd of staff members. Relief washes over Amelia, quickly followed by a sharp surge of adrenaline that makes her fingers tingle. The die, or rather the crimson confetti, is officially cast. As the scheduled time for the reveal arrives, a heavy silence falls over the garden. As if someone pulled the plug on the noise, guests drift toward the stage. Standing in the dark, Julian, beaming with pride, walks up and takes the microphone. "Welcome, everyone," he says, his voice booming out into the night. His voice is perfectly amplified, echoing through the sprawling garden. "Amelia and I are so incredibly thrilled to share this special moment with all of you, our dearest friends and colleagues," he says. His eyes scan the front row until they find Serafina. He offers her a subtle, possessive smile, which she returns with a sharp, knowing look that she thinks no one else can see. Amelia stands right beside him, feeling an intense chill despite the warm night air. Tonight, Julian continues, we find out whether we will be buying tiny blue booties or pretty pink bows, or perhaps even both. Who knows? He chuckles, and the crowd laughs politely at his rehearsed charm. But first, my beautiful wife, Amelia, has a few heartfelt words she would like to share with all of you before we get to the main event. He hands her the microphone, his hand briefly covering hers in a gesture that feels like a burning brand against her skin, a mockery of the life they once shared. Amelia steps forward, her gaze sweeping over the expectant faces in the audience. She lingers for a moment on Serafina's smug expression, then shifts to Julian's proud, oblivious smile. The garden seems to hold its breath. The air feels heavy, not just with anticipation for the baby, but with the weight of the betrayal that has festered for far too long. The crimson tide is about to roll in and wash away the lies, leaving nothing but the cold, hard truth. Amelia grips the microphone so hard her knuckles turn white, but her voice remains steady and chillingly calm. It cuts through the air, silencing the whispers instantly. "Thank you, Julian," she begins, her gaze locking with his for a long, heavy moment. Behind her composed facade, a storm is brewing, and everyone in the garden can feel the tension shifting. "And thank you all for being here to witness this with us. It is a moment about new beginnings, and finally, about unveiling the future," she says. Letting the words hang like a threat, Julian beams, completely misinterpreting her solemn tone as emotional depth, thinking it is the perfect touch. Serafina watches with a bored, condescending smile, acting as if this is just a quaint ritual she is indulging, unaware that she is the primary target. "Before we discover the gender of our baby," Amelia continues, her gaze sweeping across the crowd and resting pointedly on Serafina, "I want to talk about truth. I want to talk about honesty, about the foundations upon which a family and any marriage must be built." Puzzled frowns ripple through the audience as the guests realize this is not the light-hearted speech they came to hear. This is not the typical talk expected at a gender reveal party. Julian shifts uncomfortably, a flicker of genuine unease surfacing in his eyes as he finally realizes where this is going. "For months," Amelia says, her voice gaining a sharp clarity, "I have looked forward to this day, to the joy of the revelation. But I have also come to learn that some revelations are significantly more illuminating than others, and far more painful to face. Some truths tend to hide in plain sight, cloaked in expensive suits and whispered promises." Her eyes flick to Julian, then back to Serafina. The mistress's smug smile vanishes, replaced by a guarded, wary expression. She finally senses the dark undercurrent, realizing this is no longer a celebration. "Julian has always been a man of grand gestures," Amelia says, a humorless, cold smile touching her lips as she looks at him with detached intensity. "And tonight, he wanted a grand reveal for our child, and a grand reveal is exactly what he shall have." She turns her body slightly toward the backstage area, where the technicians, including a now very alert Mrs. Gable and Chloe, stand ready by the main cannon controls. Every move has been calculated, every piece of the puzzle placed with surgical precision to ensure there is no turning back from the storm. Leo, tucked away in the shadows near the sound booth, gives a subtle, almost invisible nod. The signal is clear. Everything is ready. Amelia stands at the front, her posture regal and her voice carrying a razor-sharp edge that cuts through the murmur of the crowd. She turns toward her husband with a smile that does not reach her eyes. "I believe it is customary for the parents to do the honors," she announces. "Julian, darling, why do you not join me for this?" "Of course, my love. Let us see what our little star will be," Julian replies, his voice smooth and practiced. He reaches for the ceremonial button that will trigger the cannons, his grin radiating a public-facing warmth that feels entirely hollow. "Oh, I think this honor should be all mine tonight," Amelia says, her voice steady as she gently intercepts his hand. She looks at him with a cold clarity that makes him hesitate. "I have been carrying this secret for quite some time, and I deserve the final say." Before Julian could even process the shifting energy in the room, and long before the high society guests realized the absolute catastrophe unfolding, Amelia reached out and pressed the button herself. For one heart-stopping, eternal second, the world held its breath. The silence was heavy, thick with 1,000 unspoken questions. Then, with a deafening and pressurized whoosh, the cannons roared to life. But the cloud that burst forth was not a celebration of pink or blue. A massive, violent torrent of vibrant, shocking crimson confetti erupted high into the sky, showering the horrified guests like a dark, inescapable warning of a life coming undone. Thousands of tiny, shredded pieces of paper rained down upon the manicured lawn like a scarlet blizzard, blanketing the expensive grass in chaos. Each individual fragment was a piece of Julian and Serafina's secret, illicit correspondence, carefully printed and diced for the entire world to witness. At that exact moment, the enormous, high-definition projection screen behind the stage flickered to life. Instead of a cute gender reveal video, a crystal-clear, high-resolution image filled the entire display, impossible to look away from, showing exactly what Amelia had hidden under a heavy veil of silence for so long. It was a photograph, the very same one her private investigator had finally secured after weeks of long, exhausting, and secretive stakeouts. It showed Julian Worthington, his arm wrapped possessively around Serafina Monet, their lips locked in a deeply passionate and entirely unmistakable kiss. The backdrop was the iconic balcony of that luxury hotel suite in Dubai, the exact project site Julian had used as his solid alibi for his weeks of mysterious absence. A collective, sharp gasp swept through the garden, sucking the air out of the space and leaving every single guest standing in total, stunned disbelief. Quiet whispers quickly turned into a chaotic, shocked murmur that rippled through the rows of gilded chairs. Phones were reflexively raised, not to capture a happy gender reveal, but to document the spectacular, public implosion of a high-profile marriage. The crimson confetti, now effectively serving as damning physical evidence, settled on the pristine grass, on the designer gowns, and on the pale, horrified faces of the onlookers. People reached down to pick up the shreds, their eyes widening as they read the intimate snippets of text, dates, and names still clearly visible on the paper. Julian stood completely frozen, a statue carved from pure, unadulterated panic. His face had drained of all color, his eyes wide with a dawning, absolute horror as he stared first at the giant image of his infidelity, then at the crimson rain of his own words falling around him like autumn leaves. He looked like a man who had been physically struck by lightning. Serafina Monet's reaction was just as dramatic. Her face, which had been so smug and confident only moments before, now contorted into a mask of pure fury and crushing humiliation as the cold, hard truth finally took hold. The crimson confetti, the very color she had so boldly chosen to wear that afternoon, now seemed to mock her, branding her a homewrecker in front of Julian's entire social circle. She looked from the giant screen to Amelia, her eyes blazing with a dangerous mixture of hatred and total disbelief. Amelia stood center stage, untouched by the crimson rain, a solitary, calm figure of righteous fury amidst the total chaos she had meticulously unleashed upon them. She looked like a judge delivering a final, damning verdict to the room, completely in control of the destruction she had caused. Her ivory dress seemed to glow in the ensuing pandemonium, creating a stark, beautiful contrast to the red paper littered across the ground. She held the microphone loosely, her expression entirely unreadable and cold. Then she raised the microphone to her lips one last time, her voice cutting through the stunned silence that had fallen after the initial shock wave. "As for the gender of my baby," Amelia announced, her voice clear, steady, and completely unwavering, "that is a precious secret that I will only share with my child in a future built on honesty and truth." She looked directly at Julian, whose face had crumpled into a mask of utter, pathetic devastation. "Congratulations, Julian, you wanted a reveal. This is your revelation." With those final words, she gently placed the microphone back on the stage, turned her back on him, on Serafina, on the shocked faces of the elite, and on the crimson-stained splendor of their once shared life, walking away with a steady, determined pace that signaled the end of the show and the beginning of her new reality. Free at last from the lies that had defined her existence for so long, her head was held high, like a queen abdicating a kingdom that was never worth the price of her soul. The architect had not just revealed a secret, she had demolished a facade, and in doing so, laid the first foundation stone for her own and her child's new, authentic beginning. The silence she left in her wake was far louder than any cannon blast. The immediate aftermath was absolute pandemonium. Julian, ghastly pale and shaking, stumbled back as if he had been physically struck, his eyes darting wildly between the colossal image and his judgmental guests. Serafina, after a moment of frozen, incandescent fury, hissed something incoherent and made a move as if to confront Amelia. But the wall of shocked guests and clicking camera phones seemed to physically hold her back. She looked utterly trapped and exposed, her carefully constructed, social climbing image shattering like thin glass around her. Whispers erupted into a cacophony of harsh judgment that filled the evening air, turning the once exclusive garden party into a public execution of their ruined reputations and their stolen dignity. Was that truly Serafina Monet from Monarch Development standing there in the spotlight? The messages flashing on the screen, were they actually real? My heavens. Seeing Julian Worthington standing in his own home at his own child-esque gender reveal party, caught in such a public display of betrayal. The crimson confetti that had been meant for celebration now drifted slowly through the cooling evening air like debris from an explosion, quickly snatched up by guests who were more interested in the unfolding scandal than anything else. Mrs. Gable, the caterer, looked like she might collapse right there, her perfect event now a disaster. Amelia did not bother to turn her head for even one last look. Chloe was already waiting for her right at the outer edge of the lush garden, a car sitting silently near a side gate, its engine humming with the promise of a clean getaway. "That," Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with a strange mix of absolute shock and genuine concern as Amelia quickly slid into the passenger seat, "was the single most intense and dramatic thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life." She was physically shaking, but the sheer relief in her voice was clear as she scanned the area to make sure no one followed them. "Are you doing okay?" Amelia took a long, deep, and shuddering breath, the sharp edge of the adrenaline finally starting to fade away, leaving a quiet, hollow sort of ache in its place. "I am doing okay now. In fact, more than just okay. I feel finally liberated." She rested a hand gently on her belly, feeling a sense of deep, internal peace she had not known for many long years. Liberated. As they drove away from the heavy gates of the Worthington estate, leaving behind the glow of phone cameras and the growing noise of gossip, Amelia finally allowed a few tears to fall. These were not tears of sorrow for the loss of Julian, but tears of deep, profound release for the end of a long, exhausting lie and for the uncertain, difficult, but undeniably independent future that now stretched out before her. Back inside the mansion, Julian finally found his voice, letting out a strangled, low roar of pure denial and anger. "Turn it off. Turn that screen off right now," he bellowed at the staff. But his voice lacked any real power now that his true nature was exposed to everyone in that room who had once respected him. But the digital image remained burned into the minds of everyone present, a permanent mark of his deception. He spun around to face Serafina, his face twisted in a look of selfish, desperate rage. "This is all your fault." Serafina, her green eyes flashing with a new, dangerous intensity, rounded on him without a second of hesitation. "My fault. You are the one who is married. Julian, you are the one who paraded me around, thinking your wife was just some clueless, obedient fool who would never actually notice the trail of breadcrumbs you were leaving behind for everyone to see. You underestimated her." "We both did," she snapped, her voice full of bitterness. Any pretense of affection or partnership that might have existed between them vanished instantly in the rising heat of their very public disgrace. The party fell apart completely. Guests began to flee, some in awkward silence, others already talking into their phones to sell the story to the highest bidder. The beautiful food sat untouched, the expensive champagne went flat, and the string quartet packed their instruments and left as quickly as they possibly could to avoid the coming storm of questions. The beautiful, classical melodies were soon replaced by the ugly, discordant noise of a wealthy dynasty falling apart. The story went viral on social media within minutes. #Worthington Reveal, crimson confetti, and gender betrayal were trending across the globe before Amelia had even arrived at Chloe's secure apartment in a quieter neighborhood. Paparazzi, like sharks smelling blood in the water, were already swarming the gates of the Bel Air mansion by the time Julian, humiliated and enraged, was left alone to survey the complete destruction of his public life and his crumbling social status. The next few days were a blur of legal threats and non-stop media attention. Julian's desperate attempts to reach out to Amelia were met with a wall of absolute silence, as all messages were funneled through Chloe, who had stepped in as Amelia's legal counsel. His first move for damage control, a quickly written, thin press release claiming the footage was fabricated and painting Amelia as an emotionally unstable spouse, failed miserably and was openly mocked by every major news outlet, which only served to make his fall from grace even more complete than anyone could have ever possibly imagined. The evidence was everywhere, plastered across every digital screen and buried deep in the memory of hundreds of smartphones. It was impossible for anyone to look away, and the evidence was truly damning. Those shredded messages and that clear, crisp photograph were simply impossible to deny or explain away. Overnight, Serafina Monet vanished from the public eye, her once promising career at Monarch Developments hanging by a very thin thread as the pressure mounted. This was no longer just a messy personal drama, as it carried huge, crushing implications for the entire business, threatening to ruin everyone caught in the wake of the scandal. In their high-stakes world, reputation and trust are the only currencies that really matter, and both she and Julian had seen their personal value drop, potentially forever. The rumor mill began to work overtime, suggesting that Monarch Developments was actively looking to cut ties and distance itself from her permanently. Even the high-profile Dubai project, which was meant to be the crowning achievement of Julian's career, had become toxic. With international partners pulling out one by one, the tremors were shaking the entire empire, and the stock price of Worthington Holdings dropped by the hour, sending investors into a total panic. The board members rushed into emergency meetings that lasted well into the night. The golden boy image that Julian Worthington had spent years building, the smart businessman, the loving husband, the family man, was now in absolute pieces. His father, a harsh, old-guard patriarch who cared about nothing but the family legacy, was reportedly beyond furious at the situation. Meanwhile, fully protected by the expertise of Chloe, Amelia began the difficult but necessary process of filing for a divorce. She did not want a single cent from Julian, only her freedom and total, sole custody of their unborn child. She had always been intelligent, keeping her grandmother's significant inheritance tucked away in a private, unreachable trust. That money would be more than enough to ensure a life of total independence for her and her baby. Furthermore, she had been quietly gathering intelligence on Julian's shady business practices for months, ever since those first feelings of doubt began to grow. Her architect's mind, which was naturally designed to spot structural weaknesses and hidden cracks in a foundation, had easily identified the deep, festering rot within Julian's carefully constructed financial empire. Those findings were now sitting in Chloe's capable hands, acting as an incredibly powerful, non-negotiable bargaining tool. Then, a sudden, unexpected twist happened about a week later. A top-tier gossip columnist, who was well known for having both reliable and dangerous sources, published a brutal article detailing Serafina Monet's own version of the events. She painted Julian as a manipulative, predatory man who had pursued her relentlessly, even promising to leave his wife and suggesting that Amelia was mentally unstable just to keep Serafina on the hook, ensuring she stayed completely under his influence. Serafina claimed she was just another victim of Julian's complex web of lies, though very few people were buying her desperate attempts to change the narrative. More damagingly for Julian, she leaked precise, damning details about his reckless spending on her behalf. This included the purchase of a secret penthouse apartment and a rare sports car, all of which had been funded through complicated, illegal company accounts that were already under intense audit. She was effectively burning his financial house to the ground to save her own skin. betraying him without a second thought. It seemed obvious that Serafina, in a frantic, selfish act of self-preservation, was determined to pull Julian down into the pit with her, perhaps even further than she had already fallen. Amelia read the article with a detached, quiet sense of irony. The snakes were finally turning on each other, devouring their own kind. It did not bring her any real happiness, but it offered a weary, final confirmation of the toxic, shallow world she was finally, mercifully escaping for good. She felt nothing but a deep, overwhelming sense of relief as she watched them tear one another apart in public. Her focus was now crystal clear. It was narrowed down to just three things: her health, the baby, and the urgent need to build an honest life, far away from the cold, glittering ruins of her marriage. She moved with purpose, changing her phone number and scrubbing her social media presence completely. She needed a sanctuary, a quiet place tucked away far from the noise of Los Angeles, a place where she could finally breathe again without constantly looking over her shoulder. She wanted a real home where her child could grow up away from the dark shadow of the Worthington lies and deceit. The chaos had completely washed away her old life, leaving her to navigate these new, unpredictable waters. She was finally steering her own ship toward a more authentic shore. As everyone had expected, the divorce proceedings were vicious and ugly. Julian was absolutely furious. His public image had been shattered into 1,000 pieces, and his business interests were suddenly under attack from every possible direction. He fought back with the raw, snapping ferocity of a trapped animal, desperate to save what remained of his fading reputation and his grip on power in the corporate world. He put together a team of cutthroat lawyers, men who made a living by destroying people in the courtroom. Initially, they tried to paint Amelia as a vindictive, mentally unstable woman, pointing to the dramatic explosion at the gender reveal party as supposed proof of her erratic behavior. But they had severely underestimated her. Amelia, with Chloe standing firmly by her side, was fully prepared for their tactics. They presented a meticulously compiled dossier. It held ironclad proof of Julian's infidelity, records from that fateful party, and all the information Amelia had gathered on his financial crimes. This struggle had transcended the simple pain of a broken marriage or a shattered home. It was now a cold, calculated war fought over potential fraud, assets hidden in the shadows, and company funds that Julian had clearly misused for his own gain. Amelia held the keys to his undoing. The mere threat of her evidence hitting the public eye or falling into the hands of relentless federal investigators acted like a guillotine blade hanging over his head. Julian saw his bravado crumble, his arrogance replaced by a terrifying, hollow fear. He realized that the woman he once underestimated was, in reality, the most dangerous person he had ever crossed. Then, the patriarch finally stepped into the light. Alistair Worthington Sr. was a man who worshipped his own name and his family wealth with a religious fervor. He wouldn't let this scandal ruin his reputation. A private meeting was summoned, not in the cold, corporate sterility of a lawyer's office, but within the heavy, wood-paneled walls of his private library. Amelia walked into that room with a calm, focused gaze. Beside her, Chloe stood like a silent, unbreakable sentinel. She was there to ensure that Amelia never felt alone or unprotected during this high-stakes confrontation that would define the rest of their lives. Alistair Sr. carried an icy, piercing gaze that had forced legendary chief executive officers to stutter and look away. He glanced at his son with a sneer of pure, unfiltered disappointment, his lip curling in contempt. Then he shifted that frozen stare toward Amelia. For a split second, a flicker of grudging respect crossed his features. "Mrs. Worthington." "Amelia," he began, his voice sounding like gravel grinding against stone. "This whole situation is a mess, a stain on the family legacy. Tell me, what will it take to make this nightmare disappear quietly?" Amelia met his glare without blinking or retreating an inch, standing tall. "I want what is inherently fair, Mr. Worthington," she stated firmly. "I am demanding a swift and clean divorce. I want full custody of my child, supported by generous, secure provisions for their upbringing and education, held in an independent trust. I will accept no contact with Julian unless it directly pertains to our child. And even then, I demand it be handled strictly through legal intermediaries for the foreseeable future. She stood her ground, her voice ringing clear and steady through the massive room. She made it crystal clear that his vast wealth and terrifying reputation could no longer intimidate her in the slightest. Furthermore, I require absolute assurance that my exit from this family will be final, with no future attempts to harass, threaten, or discredit me. Amelia continued, her voice gaining strength. She held the silence for a long moment before adding, "The financial information I possess regarding the various irregularities within Worthington Holdings will remain locked away. Provided Julian accepts these terms without a single contest and the settlement is truly equitable." She knew exactly how much power she wielded, and she wasn't afraid to use every single scrap of that leverage to protect her future and her unborn child from him. The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating like thick, black smoke. Julian, looking suddenly small and gray, started to sputter a protest, but his father silenced him with a single, sharp flick of his hand. After a tense negotiation brokered almost entirely between Alistair Sr. and Chloe, a firm agreement was carved in stone. Amelia would receive everything she had demanded. The massive Worthington empire, it seemed, was more than willing to pay a premium to avoid the risk of public humiliation and a potentially ruinous criminal investigation that could burn their family name to the ground permanently. The divorce was finalized with startling speed and absolute, quiet discretion. The media, having been deprived of the long, messy court battle they had been salivating over for months, eventually lost interest and wandered off to hunt for fresher scandals. Serafina Monet, after weeks of deafening silence, finally resigned from her position at Monarch Developments and promptly vanished from the country, her reputation left in absolute, irreparable tatters. Nobody truly knew where she went, but it was abundantly clear that her days of pulling the strings in Los Angeles were officially over and done with. If you enjoy stories about karma and quiet justice, make sure you watch until the end, because the way Amelia turned the tables is something you really have to see to believe. Some people whispered that she had received a quiet, hush-money settlement from Julian to ensure she kept her mouth shut about their tawdry affair and his illicit business deals. True to her word, Amelia left Los Angeles in her rearview mirror. She moved into a charming, historic home nestled in a quiet coastal town in Northern California, a place defined by its rugged, natural beauty and a warm, artistic community. It was the perfect sanctuary to hide away, to finally recover, and to build the kind of peaceful, authentic life that she had always dreamed of but never truly believed could be hers. She left the glitz behind for something real. She reconnected with her deep passion for architecture, taking on small, meaningful projects that allowed her to work from the quiet comfort of her new home. She legally changed her name back to Amelia Thorne, shedding the Worthington identity like an ill-fitting, heavy winter coat that she was finally thrilled to discard for good. A few months later, in the gentle solitude of her new life, Amelia gave birth to a healthy baby girl, whom she named Hope. She was finally safe, and she vowed that her daughter would grow up in a world defined by honest love instead of hollow lies. Every single choice she made was a step toward a brand new beginning. Holding her newborn daughter for the very first time, Amelia felt a profound, overwhelming sense of completion wash over her. It marked the definitive, glorious end of a long, agonizing journey through the darkest shadows and finally into a new, luminous dawn. Hope became her anchor, her future, and the untainted legacy that she vowed to build entirely on her own terms. Chloe provided the occasional update regarding Julian, revealing that his father had effectively sidelined him within the family company, relegating him to a minor, non-public role where he could do significantly less damage to their reputation. It was a slow, painful fall from his former high status. His social life had withered away to almost nothing, and his former friends had all vanished into thin air the moment the scandal broke wide open. He was now a diminished, lonely figure, serving as a walking reminder of the heavy consequences that inevitably follow arrogance and deceit. He paid his court-ordered child support into the trust punctually every single month without fail. Yet he made absolutely no attempt to see hope. Perhaps it was a lingering sense of shame, or maybe just pure, cold indifference. Either way, Amelia did not mind the silence. It kept her world peaceful and kept those dark memories firmly in the past where they truly belonged. Amelia was perfectly content with this distance between them. One crisp autumn afternoon, roughly a year after that infamous party, Amelia was walking with baby Hope in a stroller along the rugged cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The air was clean, salty, and sharp, while the sky stretched out as a vast, endless blue canopy above them. She received a small, unexpected package in her mailbox. There was no return address listed, but the box contained a single, perfect pink rose and a simple, unsigned card with a handwritten note that read, "For Hope, may her life always be true." It was such a strange, beautiful thing to find. Amelia frowned, feeling deeply puzzled by the sudden, quiet mystery. Then she remembered the original theme of that disastrous gender reveal, the classic Twinkle Twinkle Little Star song with its mix of soft pinks and bold blues. She immediately thought of Leo, the event technician who had been working that day. Had he, in his own quiet, meaningful way, finally revealed the actual gender in this anonymous, thoughtful gesture? Or was it perhaps from someone else, an unlikely sympathizer from her old life? She soon realized she would never know for sure. And, strangely, that was okay. Some mysteries are better left as they are. She smiled a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. It really did not matter anymore, whether it was pink or blue. The true revelation had been the one that finally set her free from that toxic, suffocating life. She looked down at her daughter, who was gurgling happily in her stroller, and she knew that their future, built on the solid foundations of courage and honesty, would be far brighter than any artificial, hollow sparkle that Julian's world could have ever offered them. She had truly won, and she had done it entirely on her own terms, leaving the past behind for good. The architect had not only designed her own revenge, she had meticulously planned her own glorious resurgence. And it was beautiful. Amelia's journey was a total maelstrom of high-stakes betrayal and heartache. But ultimately, it stands as a powerful story of a woman's incredible strength and resilience when she is finally pushed to her absolute limits. She did not just ingeniously change a gender reveal. She courageously rewrote her entire destiny, proving that even in the face of devastating deceit, dignity, intelligence, and unwavering courage can always forge a new, empowered path forward for those brave enough to take it. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most profound revelations are not about the color pink or blue, but about the stark, unvarnished truth. What did you think of Amelia's audacious plan and her ultimate, well-deserved triumph? Could you have orchestrated such a bold move if you were standing in her shoes, facing the same impossible odds? We would love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments section below. If you enjoyed following Amelia's story today, please give this video a huge thumbs up to show your support and help us reach more people who enjoy these kinds of stories. Share this video with your friends who appreciate a good tale of justice served cold. And, most importantly, hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so you never miss another gripping story from our channel. We are constantly digging up the best stories about resilience, revenge, and justice, and you will not want to miss what we have coming up next. Stay tuned for more, and thank you for watching. Your support means the world to us and allows us to keep bringing you these compelling, human narratives every single week of the year. We appreciate every single one of you.